Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast. I'm at Prehm and Erik Skopil on the show as always. In our Tuesday show, we always bring on a guest to preview this week's game. Today, we're bringing in InsideMarylandSports.com's founder, publisher, Jeff Ermann. Jeff, man, how's it going? First time Oregon, Maryland have ever played. This is a strange feeling. It's Oregon versus Maryland in the Big Ten. And it's a cross-country trip for this team. How things going for you guys out there?
Well, I mean, can you imagine 10 years ago if we had talked to each other? Because I know we're some of the OGs in this thing, right? So if we had talked 10 years ago and said Maryland and Oregon would be playing in the Big Ten, I mean, that would have sounded ludicrous. But obviously, Maryland made the move back then. Now Oregon's on board, and it looks good on them so far. That's for sure. You know, there's a reason it's what's the spread? Last time I saw, I think 26 or so this weekend. So yeah, I think for Maryland, it's just a matter of trying to go out there and find some things to gain some confidence from, as opposed to necessarily counting on a win.
Before we talk about this matchup, let's just go big picture here for a second. Maryland's made a bowl game 3 straight years. They've won a bowl game 3 straight years. Mike Loxley's in his 6th year now as head coach. This is the true form of what he envisions a program to look like. 4-4. This feels like a big stretch for the month of November for this program to continue this ride, to continue to show progress and development. How do you feel like this season has gone in terms of expectations at the beginning of the year, and just kind of how realistic can those expectations still be for this program?
Yeah, I think, Matt, that it's been a little, I mean, it would be sugarcoating to not say that it's been a little less than the expectations. You know, it's not like there were sky high expectations. I think Vegas set their wins total at 6.5. Obviously, at this point, with 2 top 5 opponents left, Penn State and Oregon, that's very unlikely to happen. At this point, I would think, you know, you're hoping to beat Iowa and Rutgers and get to another bowl. But, you know, realistically speaking, this probably should have been labeled more as a rebuilding year when you lose the Big Ten's all-time leading passer, Talia Tagovailoa, have to replace literally the entire starting 5 on your offensive line. And, you know, a lack of depth and experience in the secondary has also hurt. So, you know, it hasn't been a disaster, but, you know, it has not gone as planned, especially when you look at some of the you know, less flattering losses like the blowout against Northwestern.
Matt already mentioned it, Jeff, but these teams have never played. In fact, I don't think Maryland has played on the West Coast maybe ever. Is that accurate to start?
I do remember them going out to Cal literally probably 20 years ago during the Ralph Friedgen days. If you look, I think actually it's funny that I remember this, but there was a play Cal had Javid Best. I don't know if you guys go back that far.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, he one of the Maryland players then hit him at the time, and it was one of the most graphic vomiting by a player on the field I've ever seen. I think Maryland won that game. That was when Jeff Tedford, I think, had things kind of rolling there. But otherwise, no. Like the West Coast trips have been very rare, at least in the 30 years I've followed.
So I'm just curious to pick your brain and get a sense of what the Oregon brand and what the perception is out in Maryland. Again, teams never played each other. Obviously, no previous meetings, but what was, I guess, when Oregon was brought in along with Washington, USC, and UCLA, kind of the vibes out there, and kind of what's been the perception now that we've kind of seen what Oregon's been able to do through 2 months of this season?
Yeah, I think the vibes are pretty much like everywhere else toward Oregon, that they've got it going on. You know, the Nike connection, the NIL funding, some really good coaches, great branding, recruiting at a really high level, not only in football and basketball. You know, it'd be hard to find a program more on the upswing branding wise and maybe results wise, depending on what they do the rest of this season, than Oregon. So, and then you also obviously have the Nike Under Armour thing where, you know, Kevin Plank at Under Armour is kind of a minor version of Phil Knight at Oregon to a much smaller extent, but there are some similarities there. So that's kind of an interesting hook right there. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, I think everybody, they respect Oregon. It's not like it's a natural, there's not going to be a natural rivalry there, obviously. And Maryland, 10 years into the Big Ten, still doesn't have one. So we'll see if that happens with Oregon too, although you have the West Coast, a little bit more to choose from there, the other West Coast teams that came with them.
Maryland opened the season with 3 wins in its first 4 games. The only loss was a 3-point loss to Michigan State. Granted, it was at home. Since then, though, they've gone 1-3. And those 3 losses, they haven't been within a score of any of those games. And then the only win that they've had was a comeback win and a 1-point win at home against a USC team with a losing record. What's been the difference in the first month of the season to now the second 4 weeks of the season where they have struggled to win and stay competitive?
Yeah, I think mostly just level of competition. The teams they beat at the beginning were not total cupcakes. They've gone on to have pretty solid records at their levels, Virginia and UConn and Villanova. But stepping it up to the Big Ten, there were early signs when they lost to Michigan State at home. And then the Northwestern loss 37-10, at home coming off a bye is, fairly inexplicable. But I think the reality is, like I said, the offensive line has not been very good, completely remade. Mike Locksley actually let his offensive line coach go a couple weeks ago. And then they have a lot of young, unproven corners who've struggled. Teams are just getting far too many big plays against the defense.
This is the most pass-heavy offense in the Big Ten. Nearly, I think, 42 pass attempts per game. That's a lot. I know you mentioned what Tilio was able to do the last couple of years, but is this kind of even been caught you off guard a little bit with the change in quarterback? And then I guess that opens the door for you to talk about Billy Edwards Jr. and what's impressed you with him.
Yeah, that's a good question, Eric. The offense was not planned. I mean, Mike Locksley always is like throwing a little more than running, but they wanted to make this a season where they could kind of develop a power running game, read option game, short passes, because Billy Edwards does not quite have the arm that Talia has, and the new offensive line that I mentioned. But the offense has just not developed a running game at all. They probably, they're one of the worst rushing attacks in the Big Ten, and they have some talent at running back, but the offensive line has not been able to create a lot of push. So every game, it seems like I look at the final stats and it's like, 24 carries for 70 yards or something like that. So because of that, and because of the other teams being able to get the big play on them, they've gotten behind and they've had to air it out a lot more than probably they'd planned. Edwards has been really solid overall. He's had a couple rough games. Minnesota last time out specifically was a bad performance, but he's third in the Big Ten in passing. Some of that is a result of throwing it as many times as you mentioned, but I think he's quieted a lot of doubters, and he's got some skill around him at the skill position, but they keep falling into these holes and failing to get the run game going, and then there's no other choice.
I think Eric's going to dive into Ty Felton here in a second, but it's not just Ty Felton at receiver for Maryland. What can we say just about the playmakers outside of him at the receiving position, the tight end position, that's allowed Maryland to be so successful throwing the football?
Yeah, they have another receiver who should be I would think top 4-ish round draft pick, Caden Prather, big kid, about 6'4". He's kind of their deep sideline ball guy or end zone jump ball guy. Roman Hemby, the running back, has been good in the passing game, not as much, hasn't gotten as much action as you would think. I think that was a cause of frustration for Locksley also, because he talked about that a lot during the same period as he took over play calling for Josh Gaddis, his offensive coordinator, who's now up in the box. And then they have 2 really talented tight ends, a kid named Dylan Wade, who just seems to make big plays every time he touches it, and then another guy named Preston Howard. So they got some dynamic playmakers. It's just, you got to still have that meat and potatoes, and that's what they're lacking.
Let's do the Felton thing. Just looking at the base numbers and watching some of the game highlights, this is someone who's very dynamic and also extremely involved. Like it feels like, not that Billy Edwards is forcing it to him, but that this is somebody that is oftentimes the primary read. what can you say about him and what's made him so good and so difficult and to defend for opposing defenses and such an obviously appealing target for the quarterback?
Yeah, he forces it to him sometimes. They feed him that thing. I mean, some games it feels like they're throwing him the ball like 6 out of 8 plays, or I mean, he's getting a ton of targets, but it's just not all volume. Like, he's really good. He's probably, he's not necessarily at that like Ryan Williams or some of these super elite guys level, but I put him firmly at the top of that next level down. Extremely fast, good hands. That's been a huge part of the game plan, just slinging it to him quick 5 yards out and let him run with it, and he racks up the yards after the catch. So he's having a great season. I would expect he'll be, a fairly high draft pick too.
Let's go to the defensive side of the ball for a second here. They're fourth in the conference in interceptions with 9. They're just one out from being in the top 25 nationally. So you'd see that there's playmakers there in the secondary, and Oregon's a team that likes to chuck the ball around. What's made Maryland successful there, and to a degree of defending the pass and creating at least turnover opportunities?
Yeah, they've been really good at forcing turnovers. I think they're still, even with their record, 4-4 overall, 1-4 in the Big Ten. They're tied for 16th nationally in turnover margin, which is pretty unusual to have that record with that. But obviously it's due to some of the other issues that I already mentioned. A lot of it is the veterans. Glenn Miller is a really dynamic safety. They have a transfer named Jalen Husky from Bowling Green, who's all conference in the MAC. He has 3 picks also. So, it's kind of scary to think of what the defensive numbers might look like if not for all those turnovers, because they're already not. They already don't look good right now. But that's the one thing that they've been able to reliably do is force turnovers, and offensively they've been able to limit them for the most part.
Well, so let's talk the counter part of that out. You mentioned that, the turnover numbers are pretty unusual, but statistically, this is still, I think, 16th in the Big Ten in total defense and 16th in scoring defense. What's not working for this defense, I guess?
Mostly the DBs. Last year they lost. The past 3 years they've lost 3 guys who were NFL draft picks at corner. Probably should have brought in a few more guys from the portal in the spring. We're relying on some young guys, including a few true freshmen who've really struggled. And then, the defensive front, they've got a lot of talent there, but it hasn't necessarily amounted to a imposing pass rush because it's not the fastest unit. It feels like a lot of times they'll pressure the quarterback but not get to him necessarily. So the pass rush has been mediocre, which obviously plays some role also in those cornerbacks having to run around a little longer.
Injuries are always mounting, especially when you go into the month of November. For Oregon, it's hit. Star receiver Ted Johnson's not going to be playing in this game. They lost an offensive lineman that's probably not going to be playing. Marcus Harper in that Michigan game as well. He wasn't at practice. And they got a couple guys back. Terrence Ferguson, their tight end, and Jordan Birch, one of their star defensive linemen. But injuries start happening, especially now as the grind of a season really shows its form. Where's kind of Maryland at from a health perspective? Are they coming into this game, missing some significant guys, or are they relatively healthy and it's just going to be a talent matchup?
Yeah, despite their struggles, they've actually been pretty healthy. Matt, like Dante Trader, safety, who's one of their best players, has been banged up. Glenn Miller, who I mentioned, as one of the leaders in interceptions nationally, but he was back in the last game. So Andre Roy, one of their offensive tackles, has dealt with some stuff. But overall, they should be in Oregon pretty healthy. Mike Locksley doesn't really give all the information you might want as a reporter on injuries, so we don't always know for sure. Sometimes somebody just pops up before the game that he's not playing, but overall, they seem to be pretty healthy.
Well, that sounds like Coach Lanning, who I know knows Mike a little bit, and obviously there's some carryover there with Tosh and Mike being on the same staff. Maybe they've got similar directives from people they've worked under.
Man named Saban.
Yeah, a lot of Locksley's stuff is Saban influenced, so that would not be surprising.
Just kind of let's talk this through. I know we talked about the spread. It's a 25.1, and that's large, and it's probably a tough ask to expect Maryland to come across the country and win this game. But like, where could they, in your mind, be competitive with Oregon? Like, where are some areas where you think that they have the talent or the scheme or whatnot to give Oregon some problems?
And I think their hope is probably, turnovers. Obviously, they've been good at that. Don't turn it over, force a bunch, get a little bit lucky there, and try again to establish the run game. Because if you try to throw it around all day with Oregon and their prolific passing offense, that's not a formula for keeping the game close. So, I'm sure there'll be some new wrinkles in the short passing game and in the run game just to try to mix things up a little bit. They've had 2 weeks now to prepare. But I don't know that there's necessarily, unless they can sign a bunch of free agents in the next few days, I don't know that there's a recipe for the upset necessarily.
Real quick, maybe off the script question here. Is there any area that Maryland feels positive, good, confidence-wise? Hey, we've got a matchup here that we know, we've got what we can be successful here. Or is this just completely one program just in a different area than the other?
I mean, the punter's been kicking it really well all season. I think it's just two teams in different life cycles right now. You would hope Maryland would come out fighting, because it was a pretty embarrassing loss at Minnesota last time out, giving up almost 50 points to a team that's not that good offensively. So, it should tell us a little bit, at least how hard they fight, about what kind of pride and motivation they have left in this season, now that it's, a few games left and things have not gone as well as hoped.
All right, Jeff, we appreciate your time. You can read his work on InsideMDSports.com, part of the 24/7 Sports Network. Looking forward to this game. Looking forward to talking more Oregon-Maryland matchups, which will mean probably sometime here in the winter for basketball.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Thanks, Jeff.